Of the various resurrection appearances of Jesus, we give a lot of attention to yesterday's story, the story I read about Jesus' encounter with two followers on the road to Emmaus. It is one of the 2 or 3 most beloved stories about followers' encounters with Jesus after his resurrection. But much less well known is what happens next. Let's find out what Luke has in store for us next. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Thursday, April 4th, 2024. I focused yesterday on the portion of the story in which Jesus broke bread with the followers and then vanished from their sight. The story ended with the 2 followers immediately returning to Jerusalem from Emmaus to tell the 11 apostles and other followers what they had seen. You can almost hear their breathless report when they arrived in the room where the apostles were gathered. That's where we pick up the story. Luke reports, "While they were talking about this, Jesus himself stood among them and said to them, 'Peace be with you.' They were startled and terrified and thought that they were seeing a ghost. He said to them, 'Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself. Touch me and see, for a ghost does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have.' And when he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. While in their joy they were still disbelieving and still wondering, he said to them, 'Have you anything here to eat?' They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it in their presence." This part of the story is so interesting on so many levels. Perhaps the most curious thing about it is the question of Jesus' bodily existence. Recall that on the road to Emmaus, the followers were unable to recognize Jesus. And then once they did recognize him in the breaking of the bread, he disappeared from them. And here in this story, he appears suddenly to them. But Jesus makes a point of demonstrating that he is a flesh and blood human being and not some ghost-like being. This may seem like a minor point, but it is critical to our understanding of who Jesus is. The early church fought major battles over who Jesus is. Without taking a deep dive into the history of doctrine, there were major factions who insisted that Jesus was actually a spiritual being who only seemed to be a human being. For these folks, Jesus appeared to be a human being, but was really a disembodied spirit. Both the Nicene and the Apostles' Creeds were written in large measure to counter this very belief. And this story from Luke seems also to be a major rebuke of that belief that Jesus only seemed to be a flesh and blood human being, and an affirmation of his full humanity. In addition to an affirmation of the full humanity of Jesus Christ, this story continues with a commissioning of the disciples for ministry. Recall the Great Commission in Matthew's Gospel and the similar commission in the Gospel of Mark. Luke joins Matthew and Mark in reporting that Jesus specifically commissioned his disciples to spread the gospel message throughout the world. Luke writes, "Then Jesus said to them, 'These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled.' Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures, and he said to them, 'Thus it is written, that the Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the 3rd day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things. And see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." While not as forcefully stated as the accounts in either Matthew or Mark, the commission is unmistakable. Repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations, beginning from Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things, And see, I am sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high. What I'm interested in here is not the differences between the gospel accounts, but the consistency they express. They broadly agree that Jesus actively directed his followers to go into the world and bear witness to the gospel message. What this looks like may differ somewhat, but in substance, the gospel writers agree about the commissioning of the disciples. They were, and by extension we are, given a commission to bear witness to the redeeming and reconciling love of God in Jesus Christ. What that looks like, we can differ about, and different communities will disagree with one another, and it is certainly up to debate. But what is not debatable is our ongoing commission. We are all disciples, and we're all called upon to bear witness to the faith that sustains us. It is, after all, one of the most animating forces underlying our entire faith. When we return tomorrow, we'll start digging into some of the resurrection appearances as John records them. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.